Good morning, everyone joining us from Jakarta or in Southeast Asia, and then good evening to you, Professor Lampton, and everyone joining us from Washington, D.C. My name is Shafiah Muhibat. It's a pleasure for me to be the chair for today's book launch and discussion for this newly published book titled Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia. Co-authored by Professor David Lampton, Dr. Selina Ho, and Dr. Cheng-Chwee. It's a privilege for us at CSIS to host this book launch and this discussion, because I think this is a very timely topic that this book is discussing. A lot of issues are very relevant to the ongoing dynamics within Southeast Asia, where we are at. So I think there's now more and more research being done looking at specifically at the Belt and Road Initiative and overall, China's engagement with Southeast Asian countries. So I'm happy that we can have this discussion today, looking at several important issues that are being discussed in this book directly with all the authors. And we will begin now by having the Executive Director of CSIS, Dr. Philips Hermonte, to give the opening remarks. Philips, you have the screen.
Thank you, Fifi. And thank you, everyone, for joining this, I think, interesting discussion on the book that is written by the three, I think, experts, Professor David Lampton and my longtime friend, Dr. Cheng-Chwee from Malaysia, and Dr. Selina Ho from Singapore. Thank you for asking us to be your partner for this book discussion, because this book, I think, is going to be very important for public discourse in Indonesia, and I believe it will be an important part of the public discourse across Southeast Asia as well. And at CSIS, we are very honored for this opportunity to have this webinar this morning to discuss directly with the authors of the book. And I also would like to thank Bang Rizal Sukma for agreeing to be the discussant of the book. We could not find anyone else in Indonesia who could actually comment on the book, because Dr. Rizal Sukma as well is, of course, a well-known expert on the issue. So I hope that we are going to have a very fruitful discussion in the next 1 or 2 hours. Back to you, Fifi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philips. I think we can directly begin by, I'll start by introducing all of the authors very briefly. First, we have Professor David Lampton. He is Professor Emeritus of China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And then we have Dr. Selina Ho, Assistant Professor in International Affairs, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And then also Dr. Cheng-Chwee. He's the Head and Associate Professor at the Center for Asian Studies, Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, National University of Malaysia. And after the presentations from the three authors, we will have review and discussion with Dr. Rizal Sukma. He's formerly Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, and also he previously served as the Indonesian Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and now he's back with CSIS as a Senior Research Fellow. In my list, I have Professor Lampton to begin, unless there are requests that, of any change. Okay, if not, Professor Lampton, you have the screen now, please.
Well, thank you very much, and I wish we could all be there in person, but I do want to thank Director Vermonte for the gracious introduction. And I want to really take this opportunity to thank my two co-authors too. It's been such a pleasure working as a team with my two co-authors. So I'm happy to be with you all the way around. I also want to acknowledge that this is CSIS as Indonesia's 50th anniversary. And I must say, from much earlier in my career, I've over time interacted with scholars in Jakarta and at your institute. And so I want to thank you for that past cooperation, as well as the current opportunity share views mutually with you all. I also want to thank Dr. Rizal Sukma for his willingness to comment on the book and to comment on our oral remarks as well. And thank Dr. Shafiah Muhibat as well for her arrangements and for all the work she's put in. Also, I realize Andrew Mantung has also provided a lot of organizational help, and I want to thank him as well. I think the first thing to say is that this represents, I think, a kind of template for a comparative cross-national research, and could not probably have been done by just one scholar from one country. I think our research really benefited from having not only a comparative perspective of really 7 Southeast Asian nations on the continent and Indonesia, but also China, and then having a research team that was comparative and cross-national. So I think as maybe as China's closing down a bit, we're all going to have to devise more innovative ways to begin to think about China, Chinese foreign policy, and we'll once again discover, as I think we did in the 1960s, the value of a cross-national comparative political research and so forth. The one downside, I suppose you would say, for such cross-national comparative research is that it's fairly expensive. And I do want to thank our funders, the Smith Richardson Foundation, CSIS, and Stanford University that provided crucial resources along the way and let us do this. And finally, I just want to call out for expression of appreciation, the University of California Press that put out, I think, in its Lilienthal series, a handsome book, but it also has the virtue in this day and age of not being particularly expensive as academic books go. Turning to the content and sort of an overview of the project, its purposes and findings, I think it's useful to kind of understand the setting in which our writing of the book unfolded. There's been a lot of talk about decoupling the United States or Western or Japanese economy from China. With COVID, some expression of desire to strategically diversify supply chains, reduce risk through supply shortages, particularly on strategic items. And I think our book is in this era of sort of thinking about disconnection, is devoted to the proposition that over the long term, we still think integration, globalization, and connectivity are really the long-term trends. And this book on building a high-speed rail network extending from Kunming in southwestern China down to Singapore via 7 Southeast Asian countries, we think this project's moving forward and is an expression of this drive towards ultimately connectivity, even though there are going to be ups and downs as we encounter problems like COVID, strategic problems between the United States and China, or others. As the preface, or as the dedication of the book says, we're dedicated to the proposition that building connections is the future and building walls is the past. Now, this book, broadly speaking, is about how China, it has a number of foci, but one is how China acquired the technology, the finance, the human and organizational infrastructure necessary to build not only a high-speed rail system in China, but build the undergirding industry that turned out and the technology necessary, and also build the organizations that once a system was in place in China, was able to export to countries around the world, including 7 Southeast Asian neighbors, potentially. So this is really the story about how China built an industry, how it laid down a transportation network in China, and then on the basis of this domestic progress in about a decade, built an export-capable industry that now began to go in the world, and in particularly in your part of the world, in search of markets and customers. So I think there are a number of things to say about this. This era in which we're talking so much about Xi Jinping and his policies and BRI, you get a kind of China-centric, all ideas, this great Goliath bestriding the world kind of image of a powerful China. And of course, that's part of the story. But I think what's interesting about the railroad story, particularly as it relates to China and Southeast Asia, is actually the idea started in the late 19th century with British and French colonialists to the south of China. And they essentially wanted access to China from the soft underbelly of China, and therefore began to build railroads to knit together not only their colonies in Burma, in India, and the French in Indochina, but they wanted to build those economic connections to China. So it's interesting that Western China had connections to Hanoi and Vietnam before Western China had rail connections to its own coast. So the first thing to say about this is the modern high-speed rail network that we're talking about today. The earlier French and British colonialists had a similar vision, but they did not have the means to fully implement it. But the point is, it's not a Chinese idea. If you fast forward to World War II, Japan had a similar idea of building a railroad down through Burma, well, ultimately from Korea down through China, through Burma, and on to Singapore in order to avoid the US Navy and its sinking of Japanese shipping. Of course, when the war ended, that effort ended with not having been completed. But the point is that this idea of connectivity by rail had long ago antecedents, even and more recently in what we'll call the post-colonial or liberation period of Southeast Asian countries. They also had their own ideas, as you well know, of connectivity, and ASEAN played a big role. Asian Development Bank and Asian Development Institute played a role, and indeed in the late 1990s and into 2000, Malaysia under Mahathir was pushing the Chinese to be helpful in implementing a Southeast Asian vision. And in fact, the Chinese were not in a position at the turn of the millennium to do so. They did not have their own high-speed rail system. They didn't have the supporting industry. They didn't have the finance. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the engineers. So an important part of this is initially the push for connectivity really was a Southeast Asian initiative, which the Chinese initially were no position to pursue. Now, of course, as the millennium unfolded and we moved from 2000 to 2010, 2011, 2012, China did build this domestic rail industry, built out a domestic high-speed rail system with about now 30,000 kilometers. And so when Xi Jinping came into power, he was now in a position to speak to the desires of Southeast Asian countries to build out their connectivity infrastructure. So it's really a story of Southeast Asian initiative, followed by a vision that the Southeast Asian had. China wasn't fully capable of pursuing it initially, but as its modernization has proceeded and it built its own domestic industry, it was then in a position to pursue the vision that you can now see on this map. This map is essentially a vision of the high and we'll say medium high speed rail system that's contemplated. As you well know, most of the lines here have not yet been built. Some cases there are narrower gauge lines that run parallel in certain links. But basically, this is a vision of rail connectivity from Kunming down to Singapore by 3 different routes. And one route goes from Kunming through Burma down to Bangkok and then on to Singapore. Another route, the central route, goes from Kunming to Bangkok through Vientiane down to Singapore. And the third visioned line goes from Kunming, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Phnom Penh, Bangkok, Singapore. Each of these lines is longer than the Transcontinental Railroad. And of course, we know the Transcontinental Railroad transformed the American continent. It knitted our country together. The East Coast and the West Coast provided a means to ship the resources and agricultural production and steel production out of the middle part of our country to the Pacific. And it really was the basis for what you might call the imperial American era in the Pacific, to the degree that we ever had one. The American Railroad took about 7 years. It went from 1863 to 1869. And of course, the period after that was a period of enormous economic growth, territorial expansion, and so forth for the United States. So there's no reason to think that if this network here that's in this map is built out over the next decade, 2 decades, and maybe somewhat longer in 1 or 2 cases, it will, we believe, have a transformative effect on the interconnectivity or the interdependence of the Southeast Asian countries themselves. And of course, it will hook China and Southeast Asia ever more closely into each other's, at least economic and cultural embrace. Now, I should say a word just about Indonesia, because Indonesia is not, at least in any near-term future, part of the MAPS network that we're examining. But Indonesia and its agreement with China to build a high-speed rail from Jakarta to Bandung very much plays in our book, in the story here, because it, in a sense, came along first and set somewhat of a template in terms of some of the items to be negotiated between these countries on the map here, and that had earlier been discussed and are still being discussed as Indonesia itself deals with China. Now, this book is, I think, interesting in a number of ways, but it addresses some big macro questions. Certainly the biggest, and I should emphasize, this map is a vision of, it's involved with sequential negotiations with the Chinese dealing with Laos, and then Thailand dealing with Singapore and Malaysia. But you have sequential and sometimes simultaneous negotiations going on, but usually they're bilateral in character. The current state of construction is you now, I think by the end of the year, will have the line from Kunming to Vientiane. China's also in negotiations with Thailand. There's only a small link of about 3.5 kilometers that's actually been constructed, but the railroad right-of-way already exists, and there have been preliminary work going on. So we think that it's probably reasonable to think that you'll have a line from Kunming to Bangkok, just to be conservative, say by the end of the decade. There are also complex negotiations among Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, and obviously China and Malaysia. So every country is its own bilateral story with China, and also sometimes has complex negotiations with its Southeast Asian neighbors as well. But some of the big questions we are interested in is, can China do this? And we don't mean in engineering and technical terms, although there are technical and engineering problems, but we mean in terms of politically, does China have the political dexterity to negotiate with such different countries at different economic levels to get a system that meets the needs of all of these countries individually, but knits together in a well-functioning integrated system. So one of the big questions is, can China do it politically? And if so, how? And what was the character of the negotiations that produced this? Certainly another whole big set of questions pertains to the implementation literature. What are the problems that you encounter in building such an enormous system? Certainly another big question is, what will this do to the regional economy, the regional geostrategic relationships among countries? How will the big powers react, and so forth? And then one of the biggest areas that the book explores is, given this plan, how do you account for the different kinds of reactions that different Southeast Asian countries have to this vision? And one might say, just for simplicity's sake, that on the end of skepticism and reticence, you generally have Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia each have their own issues, but are also receptive to a significant degree and I think wish to cooperate under the right circumstances. So we have these big comparative issues. I will just end and then turn the stage over to my colleagues by saying that I think the Chinese are making progress here, but sometimes their foreign policy interferes with the desire of countries to cooperate. And so one conclusion is that China needs to bring its foreign policy into, let us say, more harmony with its foreign economic policy. Because while many countries want the economic benefits of connectivity to China, they do not necessarily want all the security implications they would see. And finally, if you ask, does China have a strategy? I think you can say yes, in the sense that I think China sees itself as the emerging hub of the Asian economy, and also this larger BRA version extends to Europe and to Southeast Asia or South Asia. So they see themselves building a role as a hub from which they can, I think, improve their economic performance as economic performance declines or slows, but still at a rather high rate in China. They're looking for markets and also to orient economies to flow into China and to relocate China's low-cost manufacturing industry and build value chains in Southeast Asia. So there's much more to be said about each of these, but I would like to now introduce and ask Selina Ho to talk about the negotiations and implementation, and then she will be followed by Cheng-Chwee Kuik, who's going to talk about the geopolitical, geoeconomic implications and the reason that various Southeast Asian countries have diverse responses. He also will talk a little about hedging, which he's contributed greatly to our thinking about that. So Selina, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, CSIS, Dr. Vermont, Park Rizal, Fifi, and Andrew, and everyone for organizing this very nice book discussion. I just want to start off by just showing this picture of three of us in the field, just to get a sense of how much fieldwork we actually did. The fieldwork was actually done over a period of about 5 years, and we interviewed about 150 organizations across 9 countries, 8 of which are Southeast Asian countries. And of course, Jakarta is one of the Southeast Asian countries. So this picture is actually in Laos. And, one of the things that as we go down to the ground, when we talk to the people, one of the things that we find out is that, and I think we know, people who are situated in Southeast Asia, we know that relatively smaller countries, smaller compared to in China, not obviously. Indonesia is a big country. It's wrong to call it a small country, but relative to China, relatively smaller countries are usually considered to have very little agency. But as we go down on the ground like this, and talk to people and talk to whether they are workers, whether they are employees of the government or transport, people involved in transport in one way or another, it's interesting the kind of stories that come about. And you can see that smaller states, secondary states, actually can resist, modify, challenge, initiate, and negotiate and bargain as well. So I have what I'm going to talk about the next few minutes is two parts. One is on the conditions that determine the bargaining power of smaller states as they negotiate with China. And the other one is on the implementation problems that arise as Chinese construction companies go to the ground to start digging and building. Now, the first condition that determines how much bargaining power that smaller states or secondary states have as they negotiate with China, obviously, is that size, wealth, and location still matter, right? Middle powers like Indonesia and Thailand have greater leverage than, say, Laos, for sure, and are able to bargain for better terms for themselves. I think Indonesia's case is a very good one. In terms of the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, Indonesia was able to get the Chinese agree to no sovereign guarantees for the project and to agree to a lower interest rate as well. And then you have Malaysia and Singapore as well, who are better developed and middle-income countries. Their negotiating power is also better. Geography gives Thailand a major advantage. As you can see from the earlier map of the Pan-Asia Railway, all the routes must actually go through Thailand. Now that strengthens its ability to bargain with China. In fact, one of our very interesting interviews, this time around with a very high-ranking government advisor in Thailand, this person described Thailand, and I quote, as a beautiful woman who can wait to choose the best suitor. Obviously referring to the great powers that come wooing at her doorsteps. Now for Laos, geography is not an exact, it can be bypassed, referring to the map again, it can be bypassed to the east and the west by Vietnam and Myanmar. In fact, in our interviews, there's a lot of significant anxiety in Laos among Lao officials that Laos is going to be bypassed, and they actually plead to China to ask them to not to forget Laos. Now, state capacity is the other condition that tells us how much bargaining power smaller states have. Well, secondary states have more options when they have greater capacities, such as rule of law, robust government institutions, civil society, human resources capacities, regulative and monitoring abilities. Singapore has state capacity and is not overly dependent on China economy, for instance. However, countries like Laos are heavily reliant on the Chinese economy and for technical expertise. For instance, the feasibility study of the China-Laos high-speed railway was conducted by China itself. Now, the third condition is domestic politics and public opinion. They play huge roles in determining the bargaining power of the smaller states. Cheng-Chwee will touch more on this later on, but let me outline some points as they pertain to bargaining. Well, we think of bargaining as a two-level game, and this brings to mind Robert Putnam's two-level theory, right? The first level is at the international level, where the bargaining takes place between different countries. And the second level is the bargaining that's happening among domestic agencies, including the role of public opinion here. So you have leaders in Southeast Asia countries, whether in Malaysia or in Indonesia, that be attacked because of their policies towards attracting Chinese investments and into infrastructure projects. They have been attacked for selling their countries to China. Now, there are concerns over whether locals will actually benefit from these contracts, whether in terms of technological transfer, job creation, and also Chinese companies often bring in materials from China, which means that local SMEs are being sidelined. So there are concerns whether these projects actually benefit the people. Negative public opinion and unhappiness over Chinese presence actually exert significant pressures on leaders. So if you would come back to the two-level theory, at level 2, the domestic level of bargaining, the win sets for Southeast Asian countries are really quite small. Now, this obviously strengthens the bargaining position of the secondary states when they negotiate with China at level 1, meaning, they can tell China, look, I'm putting my domestic position at stake here. You have to give me more concessions. So these are the three things that could affect the bargaining power of the smaller states or secondary states as they negotiate with China. So what are the challenges of implementation? And as Chinese companies venture into Southeast Asia, they encounter problems and issues, challenges which they're not familiar with. They are used to operating within their own system, and an authoritarian system allows things to move along relatively smoothly. Not that there are no problems, but their problems actually multiply when they go outside, when they encounter different political systems with a very confusing array of veto points or veto actors. So there's actually a lot of trial and error and learning involved as Chinese companies venture outside. For instance, one thing they encountered was decentralization politics in Indonesia, especially when they're trying to acquire land for the construction of the high-speed rail. This is really the first step of the process. As a result of delays in land acquisition, the project was delayed for several years. Now, the Jakarta-Bandung Railway was an agreement between Beijing and Jakarta with little consultation of the local governments. So when Chinese companies tried to acquire land from local regencies, they encountered resistance. And in total, approximately 29 districts and 95 villages in West Java are directly impacted by the HSR construction. So you can imagine the amount of difficulties Chinese companies face as they deal with powerful local authorities and the very strong land tenure laws in Indonesia. Now, another factor that has hindered implementation is bureaucratic resistance. You see this in Thailand. For example, the State Railway Authority of Thailand actually makes money by selling land, but loses money on rail operations. So one of the key issues in the process is that how much can these Chinese companies or compensate for the loss of land to the State Railway Authority. There are also significant legal obstacles to the construction of the Bangkok-Nong Khai high-speed railway. Laws that offer labor protection, procurement standards, environmental protection, land usage, all of these are obstacles. They are good things because they uphold standards, but they do slow down the process. So in this event, what Prime Minister Prayut did was he invoked Article 44, which is an executive order to overcome these legal barriers. Now, for any infrastructure project, and especially for railways, which cross many jurisdictions, having a champion is very important. So in Malaysia, for instance, former Prime Minister Najib was a stalwart champion of the East Coast Rail Wing and the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed railway. However, when he lost power unexpectedly in the May 2018 general elections, these projects lost a very powerful patron and was almost scuttled subsequently by Mahathir. Obviously, the ECR came back on after the Malaysians managed to negotiate better deals with the Chinese, but as has been reported not too long ago, the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed railway is now no longer part of the plan. Now, the other obstacles are a lot more technical. If you take Laos as an example, constructing a high-speed railway in Laos is a huge challenge technically because of the terrain. Laos is very mountainous, so it requires a lot of tunneling through these mountains. A total of 170 bridges and 72 tunnels are expected to be finished. However, there are also these problems of unexploded mines remaining from the Indochina Wars. One Chinese railway engineer working on the project actually said, and I quote, "We should have the United States demine the area." Now, in sum, what I want to say in my short few minutes is that there are all these significant challenges that China experienced as it ventures into Southeast Asia, whether in terms of when they negotiate with the terms of the contract with Southeast Asian government, or when they're constructing the HSR, the high-speed railways themselves. Now, Cheng-Chwee will elaborate more on the diverse responses of Southeast Asian states to China and their geopolitical and geoeconomics competition with other major powers. Cheng-Chwee?
Thanks very much, Selina, and selamat pagi to everyone. Let me first thank CSIS Indonesia, particularly our dear friends Fifi, Phillips, Pak Rizal, Andre, and also others for hosting the event. On the basis of what Professor Lampton and also Selina have presented, let me first deal with the issue of patterns of responses on the part of Southeast Asian countries before dealing with the wider geo-economic and geopolitical dynamics underpinning smaller countries' responses towards China's Belt and Road Initiative. And depending on the time I have, I might or might not address the issue of hedging. And if I can't do that in my presentation, perhaps I guess the related issues would come up during the Q&A. So first thing first, let me address the how and why issue about among ASEAN countries' responses towards China-backed railroad projects. So in chapter 4, we have this 2x2 diagram before you to basically illustrate how smaller countries have responded differently and explain why the countries have responded in a rather different way. So how and then why? The 4 quadrants that you could see represent the 4 different patterns of smaller countries' responses. And we have chosen to use Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam as examples, although you could basically apply the patterns, the 4 different responses outside of these 4 countries to other ASEAN countries, and in fact, beyond Southeast Asia. So you would wonder what distinguishes quadrant 1 and 2 from quadrants 3 and 4. Quadrants 1 and 2 are those representing more positive, more receptive responses. And then relatively 3 and 4 are more cautious and even distant. And the main distinction between quadrant 1 represented by Laos and also quadrant 2 represented by Malaysia here is that they are both positive and receptive, but the quadrant 2 is relatively more fluctuating. So you could see a lot of like on and off, and also there are some changing decisions, things that Selina mentioned earlier on. So in the case of Laos, you could see a very enthusiastic embrace in the sense that once the decision was made in 2015, 2016, once the groundbreaking ceremony was done by December 2016, you see that the implementation has been ongoing quite steadily. And then end of this year, December 2021, Laos-China high-speed rail project will be completed, and it's going to be the first railroad connecting directly to China's own vast high-speed rail system. So that's a very enthusiastic, very stable embrace. And in comparison, although Malaysia has always been very receptive under Najib, and even I would say under Mahathir 2.0 and also now Muhyiddin, you could see that this receptivity it's also colored by cyclical recalibration. Mahathir 2.0 came to power May 2018. One of the first things he did was to suspend 3 projects, including the East Coast Railing project. And then, as Selina mentioned, it was resumed in April 2019. And then this decision continued, although under the present government, Muhyiddin Perikatan National Government, there have been some changes to Section C, even though the project remain continue. So you do see some recalibration and also fluctuations on the part of Malaysia, representing quadrant 2. So let's move on to quadrant 3 and 4. And as mentioned, quadrants 3 and 4 represent those who are more cautious, more selective. So Thailand and Vietnam represent these 2 responses, although they are also different in the sense that Thailand, you could see some selective and cautious responses, whereby Vietnam, you could see that it's very limited and there is a clear stance of keeping the distance from China-backed projects, either railroad or other projects. Yeah, and perhaps one could categorize Indonesia in the same category of quadrant 3, very selective, very flexible engagement. So depending on the project itself. So, and then as to the reason of why, what reasons explain all these different patterns? We highlight the domestic factors. There are two particular type of domestic factors that help us to make sense of why different ASEAN countries, different smaller states have responded differently. The primary principal factor is actually have to do with the pathway of legitimation, particularly performance type, the economic performance, development performance type of legitimation is the primary reason that explain why countries like Laos, Malaysia, and if you want to relate to larger countries like, for example, Cambodia, have been relatively very receptive about China-backed projects. And in the case of Thailand and Vietnam, even though performance legitimation is also important, but that importance of performance legitimation has been somewhat offset or over counteracted by other pathway of legitimation. For example, the anti-China nationalism in the case of Vietnam, and also Thai identity legitimation. So during our field work, many Thai elites have been sharing with us, emphasizing or explaining to us why the real project negotiation between Thailand and China have been taking so long, many years, 30 more rounds, and are still negotiating. As of now, only phase 1 is finalized. Phase 2 from Korat to Nong Khai is still up in the air under negotiation. So I think Thai elites emphasize that this is Thailand and we do things in Thai way rather than China way. So there are kind of identity-based legitimation that explain that. And in the case of Vietnam, as I said, the anti-China sentiments have always been kind of a constraining factor, limiting as how far Vietnam as a country could collaborate or could engage China-backed projects. And they have options, and which brings me to the external factors, the geoeconomics and also geopolitical factors. Selina, next slide, please. So for the geoeconomics and geopolitical dynamics, you could see things are getting more there are lots of changes and also recent developments. Given the time, let me perhaps sum up these dynamics with 3 points that hope to capture the ongoing dynamics and also with some anticipation to see what would happen in the next couple of years. So the 3 points that I would like to highlight under these geopolitics and geoeconomics issues is that number one, regional connectivity, either real connectivity or other infrastructure, is not always or necessarily about big power push. It's not necessarily just about China push. Sometimes small countries push as well. And you could see that at the earlier stages, for example, I think Prof. Lampton mentioned earlier on about the regional initiative, like for example, in 1995, Singapore Kunming Rail Link is actually a proposal coming up from Southeast Asia rather than China. China was pulled into this regional collaboration. And then Thai scholars, Thai elite describe the whole dynamics of regional connectivity very, very well. He says that the regional connectivity is a concentric overlapping circles. You have the individual countries' efforts, you have the ASEAN-based regional circle, and you have the ASEAN Plus, sometimes plus one, and different actors are involved. So you could see these small states agency as what Selina mentioned and elaborated as well. So this is, I think, a very important point that we need to bear in mind. Even though geopolitics and geoeconomics are about big power competition, but small state agency play a role and continue to play a role, even though the space is shrinking, which brings me to the second point for this issue. And the second point for this issue has always been that Belt and Road Initiative, because of Xi Jinping's policy since 2013, has clearly become a main focus among scholars, among policy makers. But clearly, Belt and Road is not the only game in town and in various countries. Some countries have more alternative or space than the others. And to a large extent, Japan is an important actor. And as we know, Japan has always been a very active developmental partner for many ASEAN countries, mainly in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But what happened after 2013, 2015 is that Japan's infrastructure involvement in the region is not only purely motivated by economic consideration, but more by geopolitical consideration. And hence, you see the 2015 initiative of Partnership for Quality Infrastructure that continue to be very important until this day. And on top of, in addition to this initiative, Japan clearly has also tried to do beyond that by also engaging and also convincing other like-minded nations to play a similar game. So you see, and that's my third point and the final point, which is that we are seeing a more crowded developmental chessboard in Southeast Asia and perhaps beyond, because of there are more and more powers, China, Japan, US, EU, and even more, are involving and coming up with some competing connectivity schemes. For example, US Build Act 2018, EU Asia Connectivity 2018, and more recently we have hearing talks about the Blue Dot network that involving the Quad members, which of course include Australia and also India. Whether or not this direction will continue under the present Biden administration, it remains to be seen. But from smaller countries' perspective, all these competing schemes clearly present some possible alternative. Whether or not we would be able to really play up the small state agency, depending on the extent and also in what way all these alternative schemes will come and arriving to our table. With that, I will stop my presentation. Back to you, Fifi. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the three authors for their very fascinating elaboration of what the book discusses. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Rizal Sukma to give his comments on what we have been discussing so far regarding the issues in the book. Pak Rizal, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Fifi. Good morning and good evening for everyone. First of all, of course, it's my pleasure, to be joining this book discussion and launching of the book. And of course, I have to start with the, words of congratulations, for the writing and also the publishing such a timely and a very important book. And I was asked a lot, when I was an ambassador in London about this, China's role in Southeast Asia, about the BRI, and also especially about its impacts, on the Southeast Asian, countries. And most of the questions that I received was not so much about the economic nature of the BRI. It's more about the people's concern about its geopolitical and strategic implication. They asked, for example, will Indonesia or any other Southeast Asian countries become a client state of China if they take the project, And some, of course, also asked the questions about the impacts of those projects on the environment and whether the BRI or the AIIB makes sense economically, both for China and the recipient countries. So therefore, I really wish that this book has been published back in 2016, because a lot of answers to those questions actually there, in the book. It was very hard. And, Professor Lampton, I can tell you that, it's really different world, being an ambassador and as an academic. Being an ambassador, I had to struggle to find nice words, not to offend anyone, to telling things that a lot, but actually you don't tell anyone, you don't tell much. So that's the art that I learned, you speak so, for some time, but, it's devoid of the substance. So that's, I think, I really wish, the book is already out in 2016 so that I could really refer to that book, for those, who actually want to know more about the impact of the BRI, on Southeast Asian, countries. Well, the book, obviously, is quite thick, and I received it only, I think, like 10 days ago, and I haven't read from cover to cover, because over the last 2 weeks, we all actually preoccupied with a more serious problem, which is Myanmar, that, we also try to contribute to the solutions of that problem. But, I read parts of it, and I have the impressions that the book, is framed has framed the BRI within the context of change, in China's economic progress and its policy toward the outside world. So that's basically, the main framework that the three of you used, in order to understand the China's power. And the economic progress, has strengthened the determination on the part of Chinese leadership to use its newly acquired economic power and wealth at home as an instrument of power, an instrument of foreign policy to restore, China's status as a great power, after long periods of humiliation. So this desire, became more evident, as China entered the second decade of the 21st century with the rise of Xi Jinping as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC. So, we see this is in this context, the BRI is an economic project with strategic and geopolitical consequences. And I think the entire book already explained that very clearly, how the economic undertakings actually does have a serious strategic and geopolitical consequences. And all the key players in the region, the US, Japan, EU, and even China, India, are wondering about the implication of this Chinese project on their respective national interests in the Indo-Pacific. So one important point that I learned from the book is that many projects, especially railroad development, are actually not China's ideas, but come from the aspiration of Southeast Asian countries themselves. So I think this is a very important, the explanation by Professor Lampton is very useful, to understand this. So because a lot of this misperception out there, that as if that China came to us, then imposed, you must build railways, you must build port, you must build the airport, and so on. So I think, bringing it to the historical perspective and then look at the origins of this idea, I think tell us, a rather different picture about the origins of these railways, projects and in Southeast Asia. And China, simply has the technology, human resources, and finance to realize those, aspirations of many states, in Southeast Asia. And the focus on railway development is only to demonstrate, that particular, point. And a second point, I think the book also examines why and how Southeast Asian states decide to be part of the BRI. In this case, through the railroad, development projects. It highlights the questions of policy calculation on how states in Southeast Asia could avoid dependence and strike a balance, in its relationships, with China. So this railway, I think a project really, is a very powerful case to look at, in order to understand, how, this a smaller state try to avoid dependence on the one hand and create or strike a balance on the other, in its relationship with, with China. So, but, to all other readers, especially those, who not actually, expert in China. So let me inform you that this is not a book about railways. It's not a book about railroad. So it's actually inform readers on relationship between China and its neighbors, about China's instrument of power, about how China used that power, and about China's negotiation style and its ability to push through the the agreement it has reached with Southeast Asia. So it's not about book about technical methods and how you build railways and so on. So anyone who get hold of the book, please read it, because this is a very, I think, interesting book that answers a lot of questions in Southeast Asia. It's also, I think, there are a couple of points that I think is important for us, to ponder, to discuss, and also, for China. And after all, I think the readers, who will benefit a lot from this book is actually the Chinese readers, so they can understand what are the challenges that they will face, in doing this, in Southeast Asia. The BRI projects, especially the railways development project, also serve as a test, for China's power on technology. So China's reputation is at stake here, because if it succeeds, then China's, I think, plan to create some sort of global standards for railways, will of course be accepted. But if it fails, then other projects might also face a lot of questions from countries not only in Southeast Asia but around the world, because well, there have been a lot of jokes surrounding the Chinese high-speed rail in Southeast Asia. One of the jokes is said that actually they will build the rail, but they will not give you the technology of the brake. So it's really indicates that be careful with the Chinese high-speed train. So there is a lot of I think suspicions about the quality. So China's reputation here is, I think, is really at stake. So they also have stake as much as we all do, in the success of these railway projects across Southeast Asia. But after reading on the books, so I think one key question is really remains, one key challenge for China remain. China still needs to prove that the BRI, and including this railway development project, is about economy and diplomacy and not about hegemony. So that I think people will be looking for that answer, whether the BRI project is really about economy and diplomacy and not about the hegemony. So reading this book, we highlight only some part of the answers to that. I think persistent questions that many of us in the region have asked regarding to China's BRI and a number of projects in Southeast Asia. And the final point that I would like to mention as well, that I think this book already provide a very I think strong theoretical framework for all the scholars or all other researchers to use to compare other BRI projects in Southeast Asia in order to look at the way the Chinese use that power, and also how the Chinese actually negotiate with other Southeast Asian countries, because the BRI is not only about say railways, but they also build a lot of power plants across the regions. So I think the dam and power plant, so those are also, I think, interesting case studies that we can do for the next stage of the projects, in order to look at cross projects, and our focus can continue to be on those issues that Professor Lampton, Selina Ho, and Kuik focus in this book. So once again, congratulations. Thank you so much for the opportunity to really read the book and discuss it with the three of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pak Rizal. I'm going to give the first chance to all of the authors to quickly respond to any of the points from Pak Rizal if they wish. But before that, I'd like to also invite all the other participants to join in the discussion by sending in their questions. We have quite a lot of time, about 40 minutes, I think, for a Q&A session. Those of you joining us in Zoom, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. And those of you joining us in YouTube, please type your question in the YouTube chat, which will then be relayed to me. So maybe first, I'll invite Professor Lampton, if you would like, just for about 2-3 minutes, to quickly respond to any of Pak Rizal's points. You're still on mute, Professor Lampton.
I thought the comments were excellent and got me thinking in multiple directions, but it seems like a core question that you expressed at the end. Is this an economic program or a strategic hegemony program? I think is the crisp way to put the question. And I guess the way I would put it is that I think it initially started largely as an economic set of objectives. But like I think every other foreign investor, the minute you begin to nail down your investments or your resources, or you have large numbers of your citizens living abroad, whether they're building projects or running businesses, you then want to secure those assets and you want to protect those citizens, which means that the PLA and other coercive arms of China are not too far behind the investors. So even if it didn't start out as a strategically motivated program, I think it assumes a strategic character rather quickly. So that would be the first thing. Second thing is that I think then the question arises, how do you think about dealing with that? And I think one of the major recommendations in the book is that we need to think about interconnectivity in the way we used to think about balance of economic power. China's strategy and objective as a national government is to make north-south resource flows the key. In other words, supply chains moving from China to Southeast Asia, resources moving from Southeast Asia up, tourists and travel going in both directions. But the point is, China's strategic objective is north-south connectivity. But if you look at India or Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Japan, they're thinking much more about east-west connectivity. And what we suggest is we should focus less on opposing China in some sense and focus more on diversifying connectivity so that there's a balance of what you might call connectivity power in Asia. So we're really sort of calling for like-minded countries, not so much to orient. Occasionally, China might have a good idea that's in everybody's interest, and when that happy occasion comes along, we should work with them. On the other hand, we have plenty of other partners, plenty of companies, and we should be willing to work with them. So I think we have a sort of notion of strategic connectivity balance as a sort of policy direction.
Okay, Selina, do you want to add?
Maybe I'll add to that in terms of, is this a program for hegemony or is it just an economic program? I actually think that, like Professor Lampton said, in the beginning, it was an economic rationale that drove countries out. But I think in the process, they stumble on how useful the whole BRI is for establishing Chinese dominance in the region. If you define hegemony as dominance, I think that it is, in my opinion, my co-authors may disagree with me. I think that the Chinese do have a desire for domineering the region. I think that's without doubt. And it's not just in terms of domineering in material power, but it also is about structural power, the ability to set the agendas, the ability through BRIs to set standards. These are all part of the game, right? So if you are able to dominate through agendas, through setting standards in technology, in 5G and everything, you're going to be able to dominate because this is the other parties are going to be reliant on you for your technology. And I think this is an area that America has been watching very carefully as well, realizing what's happening. And in that sense, the US-China competition is now about technology in more ways than one. And so in infrastructure, obviously, it's very closely tied, the question of technology. And the Chinese are also promoting through the Belt and Road a vision of civilization, right? The idea of a community of shared destiny, a community of common destiny, which Laos and Cambodia have already signed on. And obviously Indonesia has resisted such a suggestion. When you sign on to the Chinese community of destiny, the suggestion is that it is Chinese civilization at the center. I think that is the key thing that is going to prevent a lot of ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, from being closer to that kind of vision. There is the wariness that you're going to say that Chinese civilization, promoted through the BRI is actually the epitome of civilization in this part of the world. I can imagine a country like Indonesia, rejecting this kind of ideas. Okay, so I think that it's not just about the material power of it, but also the ability to set standards, the ability to set structures, the ability to set agenda, and also discourses about civilization and what is civilization in this part of the world. So BRI is also about that. And I think, in my mind, Chinese do want domination, because otherwise I cannot understand why they would be doing all these things. It is only natural that a great power would want to dominate its region. You can see that in historical lessons. When we look into history, we can see all these kind of things happening. America wants to do that. America dominates Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So it's natural for a great power to want to do that, in a sense. Thank you.
Thank you, please.
Yeah, let me quickly engage and address these issues by 2 quick points. The first is similar to what Selina has just mentioned, which is that it is in the DNA of big powers to push the envelope, to expand, also to enlarge its influence whenever possible. So that's the first point. China is not the first, it's not going to be the last, and it's not the only one for sure. And second point is that, but this only highlights about the tendency and also the inclination on the part of a stronger power. And in reality, it doesn't necessarily mean that China will always be able to push the envelope. And within our empirical focus in Southeast Asia, for example, across countries and across time, you see a very messy results, which explain that there are other factors other than it's not up to China to decide whether or not it's able to translate its hegemonic inclination into reality. For example, you could see that Thai has a higher small state agency than, say, for example, Laos, in pushing back what China is proposing. And even within my own country, Malaysia, you see that the Najib agency is not as high, it's very weak actually because of 1NDP and other issues, than say, for example, the subsequent government of Pakatan Harapan Mahathir-led agency. So small state or host country agency matters a lot. And I think the final point to highlight is that, but I think other powers have a role to play as well. If other countries are not, other powers in and out of the region are not like engaging and providing a good, credible, sustainable alternative to host countries, then I think small countries will have a very small space to leverage. One quick example would be Thailand, for example. I think Professor Lampton earlier on mentioned about the North-South and also East-West. So we know that in Thailand's kind of quote-unquote hedging approach is that the North-South would be very much partnering with China, but the East-West would be very much for Japan to play a role. So whether or not to what extent Japan actually come in, provide credible, good alternative remain to be seen. But we do know that Bangkok-Chiang Mai high-speed rail proposal, it's on hold primarily because of Japan, JICA actually is having a second thought on the economic viability issue. So back to Rizal's question, I think it's not just about China. I think host country, other powers have a role to play as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just
sure, go ahead, Professor Lampton.
Just one minute. I agree with what both of my colleagues have said, absolutely. But this drive for, we'll just call it hegemony or assertiveness, isn't just a strategic thought out of Beijing. It's also China's provinces along the boundary with Southeast Asia are desperate to escape their own isolation within the Chinese system. And they are trying to boost connectivity and access to the ocean and economic relationships to their south, because they see themselves as naturally connected to Southeast Asia. So I think you've got the provinces, also state enterprises may be called state enterprises, but they are sometimes very cutthroat competition among the various state enterprises. And so they can sometimes implement very rapacious policies in their competition with their own firms. So I would just say this assertiveness of China towards Southeast Asia isn't just a strategic military calculation, although I think that's part of it, but it's also the desire of these provinces that are as big as countries elsewhere, plus these very cutthroat state enterprises. So the origins of assertiveness are complicated in China.
Thank you to all the three authors and also to Dr. Rizal Sukma. Okay, I have a couple of questions already coming in. The first one from Aditya Edward Yeremia. He wants to discuss more on from the perspective of the Southeast Asian domestic politics, because all three authors, you explained about your field research in the Southeast Asian countries with regards to BRI. Do you think that China has developed a capacity to read well into Southeast Asian domestic politics? You did mention all the differences in terms of domestic politics in each of the Southeast Asian countries, but has China developed this capacity to actually understand what goes on domestically in all of the Southeast Asian countries that they're trying to push this BRI projects? I don't know, who wants to take up the question first?
Well, I think my colleagues would be the more appropriate. I'll say something later, but I think they would have more value here.
Sure. Maybe Cheng-Chwee first and then Selina?
Yeah, sure. Just to get the ball rolling for this round, I think first point to say is that China has always been on the learning curve on a lot of things. I don't think that it might have a kind of like a strategic inclination to push some envelope, but I doubt, just like in any other powers and players, I doubt there is some kind of like a grand plan to execute every issues step by step in any countries. It's impossible. And things change, and we say that all politics is local and politics about possibilities. For example, Malaysia, what happened in Malaysia in 2018, not to say China, but even Malaysians cannot expect that to happen. So I think China as an external actor, and also in this case, a developmental partner, it has been like adapting and perhaps sometime make concession, but there are certain things that China would still want to get back to certain agenda. One quick example to illustrate that would be ECRL, East Coast Railing. So after Mahathir 2.0 decided to suspend in May 2018, we actually both countries went through a very problematic renegotiation process, and both sides reached renegotiation only in April 2019. And you could see that this process, China did make some concession, for example, cut the costs, and also make some rearrangement. For example, Malaysia tried very hard to get China not just as a builder, but also as a collaborator and also a partner in operating the project after the construction. So China agreed to Malaysia's proposal for example, the transit-oriented development projects along the railroad. So all these are indicators that China did not like Malaysia, smaller countries, to request to renegotiate. But when it is becoming a reality, it is a reality. China accepted and adapt as much as possible, because of that. It's just part of reality on ground.
Yeah, so I agree with Cheng-Chwee in that I think it's always a learning curve for the Chinese, and adaptation adjustments. I think they tried to do it. I mean, you can see that, in the case of Cambodia, where you have all this negative feedback about Sihanouk View and all the gambling casinos and the crime that is in there. There were some efforts when these feedback flowed up from the ground to the higher levels. There were some efforts to clamp down on all these Chinese operations in Sihanouk View. So in a sense, they are trying to respond. But having said that, I think that the response is a lot more piecemeal and ad hoc. And I think that it is not comprehensive enough. I think that Chinese expertise when it comes to Southeast Asia is still on the low side, because their greatest concerns are not Southeast Asian countries per se. Their greatest concerns are the United States and Japan. So their expertise in those areas will be a lot better than their expertise in Southeast Asia. Obviously, they will pay more attention to certain Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, like Thailand, like Malaysia, to some extent Singapore as well. And obviously the CLMV countries, which is much closer to their own borders. But I would say that if you were to look at the number of Chinese experts who know Southeast Asia in think tanks in the schools, in the universities, is still a very small group. And if you were to look at the MFA directorate that looks at ASEAN countries, I think that has grown in the last few years, but I think numbers are still pretty small compared to, say, a directorate that looks at the United States or Japan, maybe even Europe, right? But the attention is still not quite there. And they need the learning of languages and all that. I don't think it's quite there either. Although, they have sent a lot of, in my school, at least in the Lee Kuan Yew school, it is where they send a lot of the Chinese mid-ranking officials to actually study in the school. But I think that there's still a long way off to really understand what local context mean, what is the local culture. And in a way, it's very difficult for them. Can you imagine? I mean, how many Southeast Asian countries do we have? 10 different countries in ASEAN, and all the varieties and the diversity in there. You can imagine the task and how difficult it is. So I would say that I don't think their knowledge of us is there yet. Although they try and adapt, but those are a lot more ad hoc and when problems arise.
I think my colleagues are on to a lot of good points. The one I would emphasize right here is that I think it's been surprising. If you look at the performance of Chinese foreign policy overall, they've been surprised by almost every major event. They were surprised when Trump got elected. They were surprised by Arab Spring. They were surprised when Najib lost. So I think, as Selina was doing, you want to ask why. And I think the Chinese, first of all, pay more attention, generally speaking, to what they consider big powers. And also, I've noted over the years, rarely do Chinese students that come abroad to learn, in Western or other institutions, they're not very anthropological. Take Americans, they want to go out in the countryside, camp out in a village and talk to people, get a sense of how society works at the grassroots. The Chinese are not inclined that way. There's LA, San Francisco, New York in the US, and Washington. And that's what we study and assume it stands for the United States. So I think area studies is not really as strong as you might think, so to speak. That'd be the first thing I would just say there. Also, I think, and certainly this is known, and I remember working on the incident in 1965 in Indonesia, but I've always been sensitive to the role of overseas Chinese. And of course, this is a very difficult problem for Beijing to manage, and often it doesn't manage it very well. And I think during our research, you correct me if I'm wrong, Cheng-Chwee, in Malaysia, and the Chinese ambassador, as I recall, became an item of discussion during our book work. Do I remember correctly?
That's correct. You're referring to Huang Huikang.
Rizal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. Does China understand domestic politics in Southeast Asia? We don't understand our own domestic politics. How can we expect the Chinese to understand it? So, I think this is a challenge not only, about China with Southeast Asia, but also I think it's true, about Southeast Asia toward China as well. We don't also understand, China's, politics very well. And not to mention, I think this point has been raised by Kuik and also by Selina, that each this Southeast Asian state is unique, politically. Some are democracies. We still have a sultanate in Brunei, and some semi-democracy. Some are basically still communist states. So it's I think it's difficult for anybody in Beijing to really understand that.
Right.
That's the first point. The second point is that I think China expects us to understand them more, rather than them understand us. So this is, I think, big powers problem that happened with the United Kingdom before, during the the Pax Britannica, and then it happened to the US, and now, of course, it's also happened, to China, because they are the one, rising power. They are the one, the dark war. So everybody should understand me. Why should I understand you? You should speak my language. Why should I speak your language?
Exactly.
I think across the board, from the, England, and then the US, and then now, China. But I will say this. So I think there are three things that, China needs to understand when it comes to Southeast Asia. Number one, all Southeast Asian states, is concerned about dependence on outside powers. So I think they need to take that very seriously and try to understand what are the forces behind that concern. It's not only about, say, China per se, because we are also concerned if we depend on too much on Japan or, on the US and other powers. Second, all Southeast Asian states will not be happy with any attempt to impose something on them. So the imposition is not the way to go. Even, that has been demonstrated very well, even, among the Southeast Asian states within ASEAN. Nobody can impose anything. So you have to go through this lengthy process of trying to build consensus, and so on. So any attempt to impose, that's, I think is going to ruin, the plan. And third, China should understand that politics in many Southeast Asian states, not all, not only about the ruling group, it's not only about the government. So they need also to, diversify their understanding about other actors at play. So that will, I think, help the, this mutual understanding between China and Southeast Asian state. So thank you.
Thank you, Pak Rizal. I'll move on to another question now. This is a question from Klaus Radityo. Highlighting that the argument some scholars make that BRI is actually more about China's vulnerability. So BRI as a strategy for China to overcome some of its problems. Among them are, domestic overcapacity, hunger for natural disasters, dependence on the stability in the supply chain. If you look at it from this perspective, in what sense that the connectivity in Southeast Asia compensate China's weakness? And I'd also like to connect this question to another question by Wafa Karisma. If you look at it that way, how much has the BRI actually tried to adapt to Southeast Asia's own regional plan? If BRI is, a strategy for China to tackle its problems, then has it tried to adapt to Southeast Asia's existing regional plan for connectivity? For example, the ASEAN Master Plan for Connectivity, or is it really simply just China's own interest? I open to any of the panelists who would like to begin. Cheng-Chwee.
Cheng-Chwee, why don't you?
Sure. Very quick one would be, I completely agree with Klaus' observations that a lot of what China has been doing under the umbrella of BRI have to do with the need of coping the internal vulnerability. I would only highlight one example to address your question, which is about energy insecurity. I think Professor Lampton's earlier response has already emphasized that there are many factors at work as to China's policy, Belt and Road being one example. So I think one of the many drivers of China's Belt and Road Initiative, or even before 2013, 2012, is that to cope with the so-called Malacca dilemma, energy insecurity, in which China see it as in a very vulnerable and also a dangerous situation because of much, just like other Northeast Asian economic powerhouse, that they rely on energy, oil, and all that from Middle East going through Strait of Malacca and then onto South China Sea. So this Malacca dilemma, energy insecurity, has been an important driver, and that explain, or at least partially explain, a lot of policies, like for example, pipelines in Myanmar. And clearly, if you're a rational actor, you do not want to rely on just one option. You could also see that in addition to pipelines in Myanmar, China has also invested and also pushed forward a lot of other initiatives that are aimed in part, if not largely, to reduce, to mitigate the energy insecurity. For example, the ECRL is a railroad project, but you know that a component of the ECRL, a railroad project, is actually also have to do with the so-called land bridge of connecting Kuantan port facing the South China Sea with the Kuantan, with the Port Klang facing Strait of Malacca and also Indian Ocean, so that to partially address that issue. And more recently, there have been talks about similar or parallel land bridge project in southern Thailand. People have been talking about Kra Canal for hundreds of years. And clearly, now it looks like a recent kind of package or arrangement is not really to construct a canal for various reasons, but instead just to build a land bridge. I believe that all these are part and parcel of the motivation to mitigate the energy insecurity. I will stop here.
Selina?
Well, maybe I'll just add on to what Cheng-Chwee has to say. I think that actually, not just the BRI, but if we were to look at Chinese foreign policy holistically, and you were to look at how it is building itself as a maritime power, right? Traditionally, a land power, but and you would assume that being a land power, it will not be clashing with America as a maritime power. But essentially, this Chinese vulnerabilities, as Cheng-Chwee have talked about, and all the businesses that are going overseas, that actually there is this motivation to become a maritime power. Not just in terms, it is in part driven by this insecurity, but it's also about status, the status of a great power. You need a strong navy. But having said that, right, I actually think that, while some of these things, the BRI try to overcome some of these problems that China faces internally, some of its vulnerabilities, it actually in the end may, in a way, create more vulnerabilities for China in unexpected ways, Professor Lampton, unintended consequences, right? That's what we always like to talk about when it comes to China. Things like banking loans that cannot be recovered, countries that cannot pay their debts, or those would actually be one of the key issues, key problems, and not to mention all the suspicions that it has, is caused outside, externally, not just in Southeast Asia, but in different parts of the world. So in the end, there are costs as well in this strategy that they are taking. Now, I wanted to try and answer this question about the master plan. There was this question that Fifi was talking about, whether it connects to other plans in Southeast Asia, right? And I think the person who asked the question asked about the master plan for connectivity, ASEAN master plan. And as far as I'm concerned, but maybe Cheng-Chwee is more updated than I am, may not be as updated. There were no discussions, at least in the initial stage, between this transportation plans and the master plan for connectivity at all. But the last time I heard, there was this some attempts to have a conversation, but I have not been updated since, so I have actually no idea what happened, whether that conversation actually took place. But essentially, the plans are proceeding as parallel plans, and not really something that looks. The BRI, the master plan for connectivity in ASEAN, is not looking at the region together in a holistic manner, right? I mean, Cheng-Chwee, I don't know whether you have any updated information on that.
Thanks, Selina. A very quick point about this issue is actually to make a caveat to Walfar's excellent question, which is that there are two levels of so-called regional local initiative when it comes to connectivity. Because at the regional level, ASEAN as a group, we do have an ASEAN master plan for connectivity. And we know that in reality, actually right before China proposed their own Belt and Road, the kind of interim approaches that what happened on ground is that they actually tried to connect with the ASEAN master plan for connectivity and make it as the ASEAN-China master plan for connectivity. And on that basis, to have a kind of interaction between China and also ASEAN as a group to pursue and also expand transport connectivity cooperation. So that's the regional level. But the second and also more important level is actually what happened in individual Southeast Asian countries, because all of these transport or other connectivity are like happening in the host country of individual ASEAN member states. So it's a national and perhaps a bilateral. And it is along that line that China kind of see some opportunities to perhaps jump in things that national governments in the region have already proposed. I think China has been very skillfully tried to link and connect that as a justification to forge closer cooperation at the bilateral level. For example, Jakarta, Indonesia, you have the Global Maritime Fulcrum, which we know Pak Rizal play a big role. And China, whenever pushed the Belt and Road Initiative, has always been tried to justify and link it with, see, there is a synthesis and also convergence between Belt and Road and Global Maritime Initiative. And it's the same logic for all other ASEAN countries' own initiative. So I think these dynamics play at two levels. One, regional, ASEAN as a group with China, and also the national and bilateral level between individual ASEAN countries and China. Thank you.
I would just add to this whole question of what are the main drivers or motivations for China, and the questioner noted overcapacity. Cheng-Chwee and Selina both noted the Malacca Straits, diversification of transportation rationale. I think that's important. But I think there are some other things that are important as well. One is if you sort of look at the 6 economic corridors where China has its so-called BRI corridors. I mean, if I was an investor, I would think Southeast Asia is the most promising of the 6. You have very large population, growing population, rising middle class status, rising urbanization. It's very promising. So as growth is slowing in China, if I just looked at it from an investment point, I would find Southeast Asia relatively attractive. Now it has lots of problems, and Myanmar would be just one example of the kinds of problems. And Vietnamese resistance and so on. So it's not without problems, but it has very high economic payoff. Secondly, I would just make a proposition that as China's relations deteriorate with, let's say, the United States, with Japan, Australia, when China begins to worry about its periphery, it tries to consolidate its influence all around itself. So I would think that the motivation to play an important role in Southeast Asia goes up in Beijing as, let us say, strategic friction with the US and other big powers increases. And finally, I would say China sees this high-speed rail as one of its technology forcing industries. If you think of the development experience in the US with Boeing aircraft, in order to build an aircraft, we had to build a metallurgical industry. We had to build a navigation industry. We had to build airport management and flight route management systems and control and safety. So certain industries drive your whole economy forward. And I think the Chinese see high-speed rail as a little bit like Boeing. And then there's the issue that Selina mentioned about standard setting. And that's absolutely key, because a developed country relies on the flow of intellectual property licenses, royalties, and so forth, which come out of your innovation. So I think China has many motivations, local versus national, military versus civilian, but there are very good economic reasons, in my view, China would want to do this.
Okay, thank you to all the 3 authors. I'll move on to the next question. I actually have another question from Wafa, but I'd like maybe to add more to this question. I mean, he asked about, the differences in the approach of Southeast Asian countries to China's BRI projects. And I think Selina already explained earlier about these differences. You mentioned about, for Indonesia, for example, where there is more weight in terms of negotiating the projects themselves, but there are countries like, I think you give the example like Laos, who might not have the privilege to do so. I'm questioning, whether or not, there are changes to this approach that these countries have. I can't imagine that, because the BRI projects have been there for a number of years already. So maybe at the beginning of the project, the approach was like that. But I imagine that, during the course of the years, there might have been, dynamics going on in the region that, give an impact to how a country perceives BRI projects, thus having, changing their actual approach to the projects going on within their country. So I'm wondering whether or not, there are these dynamics and changes that has occurred in terms of how Southeast Asian countries perceive BRI projects. And with that, I'd like to relate to another question in the Q&A box from Intan. She highlighted the current issue of Myanmar, for example. Has this impacted on any of the BRI projects going on in Myanmar, especially, also related to the relations between China and Myanmar? I'll open this to any of the panelists to answer. I don't know, maybe Selina, you'd like to begin this time around, or Professor Lampton?
I think Professor Lampton wants to go first.
What? No. Well, I'm glad to say I did have a couple of ideas here.
Yeah.
But I think that if you really are asking, does China learn from mistakes, might be the most crisp way to put it. I think the answer is yes, sometimes. But the overriding problem is there are so many actors in China. It's not just like you have a decision-making group with 5 people, they're in power, they learn some lessons, and that shapes behavior. China has many points of initiative, provinces, enterprises, different central bureaucracies, and they all compete, and they all have different experiences. So to put it, I don't want to sound paternalistic, but for China to learn, there are lots of different Chinas here that are acting. And so it's really an enormous task in any big country. So I would say that's the first thing. But I think if you say, what has China, I think, come to realize that, first of all, some of its initial demands for development rights, I think particularly of Thailand and Laos, but particularly Thailand, China made some really tough demands early on for right-of-way development and so forth. And the Thais, my colleagues can correct me, but seem to be pretty exasperated with the extensive character of Chinese demands, and finally decided to finance essentially much of this themselves. Similarly, the Chinese learned that it's one thing to build a railroad, but who's gonna manage it? And so they've had to develop contracts to train the partner countries' workers in China and so forth. I think they've learned that there are different kinds of countries in terms of governance in Southeast Asia. As one interviewee said to us, dealing with democracies is really difficult. Just about the time we get to know the actors and how the system works, it then changes. And certainly Malaysia would just be a good example of the fluidity of democratic system. Finds it much easier to deal with Laos and the Chinese and the Lao People's Party. So yes, I would say the Chinese are learning, but learning is a big task in China. And then, of course, reality keeps changing in each of these countries.
I think, Fifi, you were asking about whether perceptions of BRI is changing with what's going on. And I think it's not just about China being more assertive, with its own wolf warrior diplomacy, aggressive movements that are going on in the South China Sea, and also the whole COVID situation as well. I think that one thing is that I think there are a few things to look out for. I don't think this is a straightforward answer I'm going to be able to give you, Fifi. One thing to look out for first is that I think the appetite for infrastructure has not gone away. whether it's whether COVID or more assertive Chinese foreign policy, the appetite for infrastructure has not gone away. It is there. The foundations are there. The dynamics are there. Countries in this region require infrastructure. It is considered a source of growth, job creations. This is essential for the economy. And for many elites in this part of the world, it is part of the legitimating narrative, right? To build infrastructure, to build growth. So the hunger for infrastructure has not gone away. So in that sense, the hunger for BRI has not gone away. But what is interesting though, I think that is perhaps what we are seeing is shifting perceptions of BRI. While this hunger for BRI infrastructure has not gone away, elites have made the calculation that they have to go on this BRI bandwagon. There is this greater sense of wariness that keeps on increasing. And this wariness that keeps on increasing, you can actually see it in some of the surveys that have been done. And I'm going to do this, my usual thing. I always talk about this survey. I think Cheng-Chwee knows what I'm talking about, and so does Professor Lampton. The Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, National University of Singapore, actually have this survey. And I think they probably surveyed you guys too in CSIS. Probably Cheng-Chwee as well got surveyed too. But Southeast Asian perspectives are all the major powers in the region. Now, they didn't ask, but I can't remember whether there were exact questions about the BRI, but there were several questions that measure trust and how they perceive China as whether the biggest economic leader. It is the biggest economic leader in the region. The region regards it as that. And that tells you the perception of the BRI. It's still there. It's something that the countries in this region want to harness for their own domestic interests. But the level of distrust of China has gone up at the same time. Now, this is a very interesting dynamic that's going on. And the question is whether such a thing is sustainable, whether you can look at another country for economic goodies, infrastructure, money for infrastructure, technology for infrastructure, and yet the trust level keeps on going down. So this is where I think the dynamics is going to be changing, and it's going to be fluid, and it's something that we should be watching out for. I mean, if you look at Philippines per se, you can see what's happening now. You can see Philippines shifting its tone about China, especially after the Chinese boats went into the Filipino EEZs in the South China Sea area, in the Spratly area. So you can just imagine what's happening here. There is this tone that is changing, despite all the good things that China is trying to do in the region. So these dynamics are actually pulling in different directions, and I think it's worth watching to see how this plays out. Sorry, Fifi, no straight answer.
Fine, Cheng-Chwee, please.
Sure, I agree with what mentioned by Professor Lampton and also Selina. I will only add one point, which is the importance of elite or elite politics in the whole question. So I guess a quick answer to the question of whether and in what way there have been any changing perception on the part of Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis China depends largely, not completely, largely to whether and in what way elite politics are actually changing in the host country. So I think Professor Lampton used Malaysia and also Thailand in his responses. So let me also add on with the same examples. So you could see that when ruling elites of the day are changing, you do see some adjustment on the part of a host country's policy. For example, you compare Najib and also Mahathir 2.0. But overall, over a long period of time, you could also see that although there are some changing policies, but those are actually not necessarily a departure. There are mainly adjustment. So it's not like whether they would want to continue to collaborate with China on Belt and Road, but they are having different approaches or preferences to do that. Good example would be Thailand, for example. You would see that we actually during the interview, we had a chance to talk to Prime Minister Abhisit, and he shared with us about how he started to actually talk to China on the possibility of high-speed rail and all that. But we knew that in reality, what happened was that when Abhisit was no longer in power, under Yingluck, under Prayut, and then Prayut also before and after the election, you do see that they have basically overruled many other policies of their predecessor, except the collaboration with China on high-speed rail. So that explained that there are some domestic logic or necessity. And I agree with Selina that performance legitimation, it's really a key factor that explains why the change of leadership, the change of ruling elites might show some differences, but the ultimate decision is that, look, we need to collaborate with China on this because it brings some developmental benefits in one way or another. I will stop here.
Rizal, would you like to add anything?
No, actually, but I think we need to take advantage of Professor Lampton and Kuik and also Selina here. There are, I think, 2 more questions for them.
Sure.
Especially on the hedging.
Okay.
Answer that,
Okay, I'll move on to that question. I think this is from Muhammad Habib. He addressed this question specifically to Cheng-Chwee, but anyone else can also contribute. It is about the use of the concept hedging. Could you explain how the concept is explored and used in this book? Do you suggest that other geopolitical initiatives proposed by other major powers also affect the way that Southeast Asian countries perceive Chinese projects?
Yeah, very good question. Cut the long story short, I would say that early on we mentioned about big powers' DNA. So now let's talk about the DNA of smaller countries, especially smaller countries' behavior under high uncertainties. So the argument has always been that when stakes are high and situations are uncertain, smaller countries will always try to hedge in one way or another. And the inclination is always there. And how do we hedge? We will try to diversify, avoid putting all eggs in anyone's basket. We would try to keep some fallback position to have something to hold on to if what we are undesired will happen, right? But again, just like a big powers kind of quote-unquote hegemonic inclination, smaller countries' hedging inclination also remain as a tendency and inclination. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will always be able to get what we want. So it depends on what factors. It depends on a lot of what leverage a smaller country has. What other external options and space do we have? So in this case, early on, we emphasize about the importance of alternative schemes out there. So if there are some competing alternative schemes, then I think smaller countries can hedge in one way or another. They will say that, oh, we are not in a hurry. I think Selina mentioned it in the case of Thailand, we are pretty lady, we can wait, right? So Japan at the moment said no to Bangkok, Chiang Mai high-speed rail. But I think Thai elites, either prior or perhaps beyond, will say that we can wait. Hopefully there will be others who come to a picture. Same with Vietnam's situation. So they will continue to believe that there are some space to hedge. But Laos would think that they are more in an urgency that we need to have some important developmental projects that would transform the fate of Laos from a landlocked to a landlink country, right? Hence the book title, Rivers of Iron, that they see it as a do or die thing. And then they do not have much alternative. So there is a very small space for countries like Laos to hedge in one way or another. I think let me add one more example and then we'll stop. It will be about Cambodia, right? I think there are lots of misconception that Cambodia is already in China's basket. But during our fieldwork, we don't actually have that impression. I think Cambodia is quietly hedged in one way or another. Even in the case of Sihanoukville, many analysts, observers say that Sihanoukville as if it's already a China city or China place. But actually there are some presence of Japanese economic projects. The port, for example, is actually in the hand of Japan. And clearly there have been some conscious efforts and also attempts on the part of Cambodian to actually engage and enlarge Japan's involvement in Cambodia development and also strategic defense cooperation so that Cambodia can have some space and leverage to hedge. But whether or not this will succeed, really depending on what will happen on ground. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheng-Chwee. Professor Lampton, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think just the latter point that Cheng-Chwee made is really worth emphasizing, and that is when we ask a question about hedging, I think our immediate framework is that somebody's hedging against China. But as in some cases, China provides a hedge against something another country is worried about. For instance, I was so struck being in Cambodia and finding that in some sense, the Cambodians used Chinese military to hedge against their big enemy regionally, Vietnam, right? So these regions have more than one thing, and these countries have more than one security concern. And so you can find them in one level hedging with the US with respect to China, but hedging with China against Vietnam. So I think this is really complicated.
Thank you so much, Professor Lampton. Any last words from, I don't know, Selina, maybe? Before, I think we have come to the end of the Q&A session. Selina, any?
Yeah, no more.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much again to all of our speakers, Professor Lampton, Selina Cheng-Chwee, and Pak Rizal, for our very interesting discussion today. I do believe that, as I said in the beginning, that the book is very timely on various of issues very pertinent to Southeast Asia. And I think those interested in Southeast Asian issues and also BRI would benefit a lot from this book. So thank you again and for all the three authors for actually coming up with this book, which would be very useful to everyone. I will not, of course, summarize any of the points of the discussion, but I do think that, you know, if you have any further questions or issues, then I don't know, maybe you can reach out to any of the authors for some clarification. And with that, you know, on behalf of CSIS, again, thank you, all of you, for attending this webinar. I see Phillips is back with us. Maybe I'd like to invite him for a minute or two to close the session. Please, Phillips.
No, Fifi, I was just listening, and once again, I just want to thank Professor Lampton, my friend Cheng-Chwee, and also Selina Ho for joining us this morning. And good luck with your other events of the book. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank all of you.
Thank you so much. And with that, I close the session today and wish everyone good health and good night. A very good night to you, Professor Lampton. I hope you will have a very enjoyable rest this evening. So thank you and see you in the next event of CSIS.